You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. On this edition, we'll hear from a taxi worker who's seen customers choose cabs over ride-hailing services because of a huge surge in, surge pricing.
All along, we've been saying that Uber and Lyft have artificially low prices. They have been subsidizing their service at huge losses of billions of dollars. And the prices that they're charging now, while they may be pandemic related, are probably more realistically what the actual cost of the service is.
I'm Laura Wennis, and this is Civic. Before we get started, I wanted to see if I could get 5 minutes of your time to tell us what you think of the show. We're coming up on our second anniversary, and we want to get better and bring you the conversations that you're interested in. So if you have a moment, fill out our survey at surveymonkey.com/r/civic listeners. I'll put a link in the show notes too. Thank you so much. A shortage of drivers has reportedly been affecting both the ride-hailing and taxi industries. There aren't enough to meet demand right now. But as demand spikes and other factors collide, dynamic pricing on ride-hailing apps has meant that some users have seen their prices spike. That means some have returned to traditional taxis instead. We wanted to know how that shift has affected people in the taxi industry. So I talked about this with Mark Gruberg, a veteran taxi driver and organizer. He told me that while some drivers have not been working during the pandemic, taxi workers have stayed busy. The Taxi Workers Alliance, which he's part of, has been holding meetings and pushing forward on advocacy issues, like getting funding for wheelchair-accessible taxis and supporting taxi drivers whose medallions have been foreclosed upon. Those cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mark has been a San Francisco taxi driver since 1983. He has his own taxi medallion, of course, and he drives with Green Cab. He personally hasn't been driving throughout the pandemic, but he does plan to come back soon. And he's a board member of the San Francisco Taxi Workers Alliance. Here's Mark. I want to start by running this by you. Headlines and anecdotes tell me that people are ditching Uber and Lyft for cabs. Has that been your observation also?
There has been a strong uptick in business for taxis. From everything I'm hearing, that is attributable to Uber and Lyft prices, which have, as I understand it, gone through the roof.
And how does that change things for taxi drivers? Because you've been competing with the extremely low prices of Uber and Lyft for many years.
All along, we've been saying that Uber and Lyft have artificially low prices. They have been subsidizing their service at huge losses of billions of dollars. And the prices that they're charging now, while they may be pandemic related, are probably more realistically what the actual cost of the service is.
So Flywheel, which is an app that kind of works similarly to Uber and Lyft, but it works for cabs rather than ride-hail companies and ride-hail drivers who are sort of subject to, I think, slightly different rules than the Uber and Lyft apps, is seeing a reported record number of new downloads and bookings, roughly triple what they saw earlier this year. What is your take on Flywheel and your experience with them, if you have any?
Yes, I've used the Flywheel app. I think it's a good app. From everything I've heard, it's technologically the equivalent of the Uber and Lyft apps. And it's a very convenient way to get a taxi. So, I urge people to use it. And also, Yellow Cab has an app called Yo Taxi. It's not as widely in use as the Flywheel app, but it's also a very functional app.
What is it like to use from your end? Is it like you just mark yourself as here I am, I'm available to be called up via this app, and then it matches you with people? Is there some complicated setup that you have to go through? What is the experience like for a driver?
It's very simple. You turn the app on, and if you are the closest available taxi, it will offer you the ride. You have a choice of accepting or declining. And if you accept it, it will give you the location of the passenger. and you go there and pick them up, and the rest of it works like Uber and Lyft. The payment is seamless. Drivers are generally very satisfied with it.
What kind of information do you get about a ride that would help you decide whether or not to accept it? Does it tell you where the person's trying to go?
No, up to now, they have not given destination locations. And actually, I think that's a better feature because if you know that it's going to be a very short ride, you might turn it down. And while that might be of some help to the driver, it's certainly not a help to the passenger. And we want to serve as many people as possible. And you take the good with the bad, and it all averages out. So the fact that the driver does not know the destination, I think, is a good feature. Although I do believe that the MTA is considering including the destination as part of the information that the driver would receive. I'm not so sure that would be a wise way to go.
And that's a decision that the MTA would make rather than the developers of these apps?
Well, they are in the process of creating new rules. And as part of the functionality of the app, I think that the app would be required to allow the passenger to put in a destination. Now, whether that would necessarily mean that the driver would see it, I don't know. So that's a little questionable in my mind.
Right. What kinds of things have you been hearing from passengers? Now that vaccination is up across the city, things are starting to open back up. At the same time, we have this surge in in the Delta variant. What are you hearing from passengers in terms of how they get around and, whether or not they've decided, forget Uber and Lyft, I'm back to taxis for good? Are they saying anything?
Well, I haven't had direct contact with passengers. I do talk to some of the drivers. Passengers are using taxis to a much greater extent, and whether they will stay with taxis, if Uber and Lyft return to their, subsidized under cost pricing, I don't know. What I'm hopeful is that they will find that they have a better experience in taxis because taxi drivers are professional drivers. Most of the drivers we have in the industry right now are long-term time career drivers, and as opposed to Uber and Lyft drivers who are, most of them, very, very temporary, many of them, part-time. And I think that taxi drivers will give you a better experience. So I'm hopeful that passengers who go back to taxis will find that the service, is a better service. And critical to that is the ability to pick people up in a reasonable amount of time. And I think the apps are helpful in that sense. In that, if you're calling through a conventional telephone dispatch service, it probably will take longer than if you use the app, which is designed for a more efficient service. The other question about that is supply and demand. And we have had a number of drivers, most drivers have been sitting out the pandemic. And so at this point, there is, just as Uber and Lyft have been experiencing, there is a shortage of drivers compared to demand. I believe that may change in the near future. Unemployment benefits are soon to run out, and I think some drivers who've been sitting on the unemployment will probably come back to driving, and that will kind of equalize things.
Well, yes. According to the SFMTA, just under 500 taxis were operating in the city in June. Is that enough to meet demand, and how does that compare to pre-pandemic times?
Well, we had at a high point, we had almost 1,900 taxis operating.
Wow.
And that number has gradually diminished. I think that at this point, there are probably about 1,100 taxis. Don't quote me on this because it may not be completely accurate, but I believe that's a rough figure of the number of taxis that currently could be in operation, eligible to operate. but so many drivers have been, waiting it out. And up until very recently, the demand was so low that all of these cabs are just sitting in taxi lots or in people's garages. I do believe that's going to change rather quickly, though.
And it's just because the unemployment is going to run out, or are there other factors as well? Because that's a
Well,
bit, grim that people would prefer not to expose themselves or to drive during the pandemic, but because they're going to pretty much be out of luck otherwise and have no income, they gotta.
well, I don't think it's just unemployment. I think that drivers are genuinely concerned about the virus, and now with the Delta variant,
Mm.
some of our expectations about drivers coming back may not come true because the Delta variant is a great concern. And the drivers who are driving, I should say, these are frontline workers.
Right.
These are essential workers who are putting their health at risk by doing this job. So I'm very, very cognizant of that and admiring of that in the drivers who've been working. But the Delta variant, I think, is going to have a dampening effect on drivers coming back. And also, some drivers undoubtedly have found other employment. Maybe they found jobs where they don't have to directly contact the public. And some of those drivers may never come back.
But you still think that the shortage is not going to last?
I think that the shortage will alleviate itself. I don't know if it's going to, completely come back. I suspect that some Uber and Lyft drivers do drive taxis as well. We have many drivers who do both.
Oh.
And there are also some drivers who find they're unhappy with Uber and Lyft and drive taxis. And that is likely to continue. So I think gradually over time, there will be an equilibrium. And if the demand holds up, there will be drivers to fill that demand.
How does a driver shortage affect taxi drivers who are on the road right now?
Well, economically, they are doing better. We suffered tremendously from the onslaught of Uber and Lyft, and driver income was just slashed. It was just decimated. But now things have come back to, I don't know if they've come back to a pre-Uber and Lyft point, but they have come back to a point where I think drivers can make a reasonable amount of money driving a cab. We'll have to see how that holds up as things play out.
Let's hear more from Mark Gruberg about a driver shortage and how dynamic pricing in the ride-hailing industry appears to have been pushing passengers toward taxis. And then the same logic that you've just rolled out in terms of, well, unemployment may be ending. People may just feel like this is the right time for them to come back. That also applies to Uber and Lyft drivers. And there has also been a shortage of ride-hailing drivers, which is part of the reason that the companies have given for the prices being so high, especially during surge times. So if that happens with ride-hailing drivers as well, that workforce starts to come back, do you expect that there will be sort of a flux again of people an outflow of customers back to Uber and Lyft?
It's a possibility, but if they feel that they're getting superior service from taxis, I hope they stay with taxis or even equivalent service from taxis. Remember that taxi drivers are professional drivers. They are accountable. They have to have a permit to do the job. There is no such permit for an Uber and Lyft driver. Of the Uber and Lyft drivers that you see in doing the job today will not be there in 6 months or a year. The vast majority will not be there in 6 months or a year, and they've always found ways to replenish those drivers. Maybe that will continue to hold true. I don't know, but I'm hopeful that the taxi experience will be a good one and that people will stay with taxis. And also, Uber and Lyft, a couple of factors kind of presage the fact that they are not going to go back to their old rates. One of which is that they do have some additional costs related to Proposition 22, which I'm sure you're aware. They used to defeat employee status, but they did take upon themselves certain obligations that will be more costly. And also, eventually, they have to show a profit. They can't go on indefinitely losing money. So if they, just set their rates at a level in which they can achieve a reasonable profit, I think taxis are going to be competitive.
You have mentioned now a couple of times, I think, this permit or medallions. Can you explain briefly how the taxi medallion system works and what a medallion even is?
Yes, a taxi medallion is basically a permit that the city issues to allow a taxi to operate on the streets. So the medallion for many years was issued only to active taxi drivers. Now, theoretically, others can obtain taxi medallions to purchase, but in fact, nobody has purchased a taxi medallion in the last 5 years, owing to the fact that the city has set a price of $250,000. That's a fixed price, and it's far over, the actual value of a medallion if it did have a market value. And so
why is it so dang high? That is an extraordinary amount of money.
It is an extraordinary amount of money, and it basically comes down to the fact that in 2010, the city of San Francisco decided that it would cash in on the medallion system. Before that, medallions were issued to taxi drivers based on their experience and their position on a waiting list. And the driver could get a medallion for the price of an application fee. And then city under Gavin Newsom decided to cash in and turn the taxi medallion into a cash cow, which many of us in the industry, including myself, fiercely fought for a number of reasons. One of which was that drivers had waited many years on a waiting list, and suddenly that list was closed, and the only way that they could obtain a medallion was through purchase. And all those years that drivers had waited, in good faith, in anticipation that they would get a medallion in turn, those hopes were crushed. And they set a price of $250,000, which seemed at the time to be a reasonable price compared to the income that could be generated by a medallion. However, very shortly after Uber and Lyft came in and the business crashed, and the medallion was worth, in practice, nothing near $250,000, but that was the fixed rate that the city had set. So the people who bought them basically became prisoners in these medallions. They could not sell them. They had huge debts. Most of them had taken on loans of $200,000, in many cases more. And they had these huge monthly payments to make, and the income generated did not suffice to do that. And as a result of the 700 or so medallions that were sold, about 300 of them have now been foreclosed upon. The loans were foreclosed and the medallions were taken back, and they're in the hands of, mostly in the hands of the San Francisco Federal Credit Union, which is suing the city, and that lawsuit is about to come to trial. It's coming to trial on August 30th.
Okay, give me a little bit more background here, because that was a lot of things that you just laid on me in rapid succession. So the credit union now has these foreclosed upon medallions and is suing the city for the debt?
Well, what they're suing the city for is that they are saying that the city basically abandoned the taxi medallion program by not giving it its support, by allowing Uber and Lyft to come onto the streets, by not doing what they needed to do to promote taxis in San Francisco. And so they are saying that the money that they have lost owing to medallion holders who couldn't pay their loans, that the city owes that to them. And they're basically saying that the city, by virtue of its commissions and omissions, has in practice shut down the taxi medallion system.
Just to be clear, the reason why there haven't been any medallion sales in the last 5 years is because there are simply no buyers, or because the program is on ice, or why?
Well, the city would be happy to sell a medallion, but nobody is going to pay $250,000
Right.
for a taxi medallion. The revenue that it generates just isn't there. The competition from Uber and Lyft make the future value of the medallion highly problematical. And the same thing has happened in other cities across the country. New York medallions achieved a value at one point of over $1 million, and which was an incredible bubble. I mean, I think it dwarfs and puts to shame the real estate bubble that caused the depression of a decade or so back. The New York medallion values, I'm not sure where they are now, but they're definitely under $200,000, maybe $120,000 or something like that. San Francisco medallion probably would not be worth even nearly that much if there was a real market in them right now. I have no idea what they would be, but $250,000 is outlandishly overpriced.
Yeah. Well, actually, so I do want to talk about earnings a little bit, because according to the San Francisco Examiner, some of the reasons that customers have cited who choose taxis is that taxi drivers tend to know the city better and how to drive in it. They're stringently vetted. And customers feel that they have this assurance of knowing that the driver is going to be properly compensated. Is that last one really something I, as a customer, can be assured of if I take a cab? Like, who takes a cut? How transparent is that? Am I sure that the driver's getting paid fairly?
No, there is no assurance, and that's been a factor and feature of the taxi industry for ages and ages. The risk is basically upon the driver. There are a couple of ways that drivers operate. One is to own their own cab, and in that case, the risk is entirely upon the driver. The other is to work for a cab company, in which case they pay a lease fee to the cab company. We call it a gate, and that's a fixed fee which the company charges, and the driver pays their own gas, pays other expenses such as tolls and airport fees, and whatever they're left with at the end of the shift is what they take home. And when things are bad, drivers can take home little or nothing, or even less than nothing, meaning that they're actually in a hole and they owe the company more than they have, brought in gross revenue in the course of the shift. When things are good, the driver can go home with money in their pocket, but the risk is on the driver. I don't think the public can have any assurance that the taxi driver is making a reasonable income or doing, any better than an Uber or Lyft driver.
How are taxi rates set?
Taxi rates are set by the city of San Francisco. There has not been an increase in the taxi fare in, I believe, now over a decade. And so even though inflation has been rather low, if you consider that span of years, taxis are actually now much cheaper than they were, 10 years ago.
Wow. So where does that leave, I guess, your advice to people who are looking to get around town? How should we think about the compensation of taxi drivers and these rates versus the somewhat less transparent and more fluctuating rates and compensations for Uber and Lyft drivers? I mean, like you say, if there's no assurance that either driver is going to be paid well or even enough to survive, which is the better choice? How do I choose?
I would say it's in the hands of the public, because if the public wants superior service, that is to say, if they want a driver who knows his way around or her way around, if they want a driver that actually has a permit to do the job, that has undergone an official training course, that goes through, drug testing, that, has official inspections for the taxis, none of which take place for Uber and Lyft, that they should take a taxi. And if the public responds, to that and takes taxis, then drivers will make a reasonable income. It will be a win-win for both the public and the drivers and for the taxi industry.
There is one mode of transportation that I haven't talked about. I know even before the pandemic and at full service, getting from one side of town to the other on public transit could easily take an hour, depending on how many transfers you have to make or which lines you need to take. I imagine cutting back the hours and frequency of those transit modes made an even, less attractive option for people who are trying to get across town. To what extent do you think the reduction in public transit services during the pandemic has played a role in the dynamics of how people choose to travel?
Well, it has played a role. Obviously, with the reduction in uni service, some people have had to find other ways to get around. And actually, the MTA has responded in that sense, because they have long had the paratransit program, which provides steeply discounted rides to people who can't use Muni or can only do so with great difficulty. They expanded that program by issuing what they call an essential trip card to people who didn't qualify for the paratransit program but needed transit service so that they could get to the grocery store, get to the doctor, or whatever. And by the expansion of this service, they put many more people in taxis. So that has been a help, and actually was a critical help to the taxi industry at a time when demand was at its lowest, in the early and middle months of the COVID pandemic, and even until, very recently, when demand had started to pick up again. The essential trip card provided rides for drivers that really probably kept many of them in the job and able to make, enough to get by.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mark, this has been educational. Is there anything you wanted to talk about that I didn't specifically ask you about?
I would just say that the Taxi Workers Alliance, has been active throughout the pandemic. We hold monthly Zoom meetings with drivers. We have been working on issues, including getting funding for ramp taxis, which are the wheelchair accessible taxis. We're hoping to get funding from the CPUC for that. We've been working on keeping taxis able to use Market Street. The MTA has had plans to restrict taxi access to Market Street, not ban them, but restrict them. And we've been working on that, and the MTA's plans on that seem to be in flux right now, and we're hopeful that there'll be a good resolution of that issue. And so there has been a kind of a lull, owing to the pandemic. There's a lot of work going on to try to keep taxis accessible to the public, to have taxis, better able to serve the disabled community. And we've also been working on the medallion issue, so that these medallion holders who have these enormous debts and are, the 400 of them who have not yet lost their medallions but are in danger of losing them, so that they will get some relief. And that's another issue that we're working on.
Mm-hmm. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate you talking with me.
Well, thank you. I really do appreciate it.
That was Mark Gruberg, a San Francisco taxi driver since 1983 and a board member of the San Francisco Taxi Workers Alliance. I'm Laura Wennes, and you've been listening to Civic. Before I let you go today, at the Public Press, which is Civic's parent organization, we've been working really hard during this pandemic to pursue angles we're not seeing much coverage of elsewhere, or to take a more systemic look at the issues that are surfacing in the headlines. The San Francisco Public Press is a nonprofit, and we're inspired by the public radio model. That's the idea that people who are able to support the work that we do so everyone can have access to it without paywalls or ads. If you think we're onto something, we'd very much appreciate if you could show your support. You can do that by going to sfpublicpress.org/donate or by helping us get the word out about this show. Subscribe on whichever podcast platform you use or leave us a review. It really does help, so thank you.